Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. This evening, I will be reading chapter 16, which will be presented in 3 parts. Yes, said their welcome intruder, and it's Emily. He smiled at her, then looked at Will. And it's the Lord of the Manor, Lord William, isn't it? Just Will, he replied. Ah, I see, said Jeremy. And is that how you care to be styled? Just Will, not Lord Will, or your something very grand-soundingness? Though feeling off balance, Will couldn't help but smile. Just Will, he said. Jeremy stepped forward into the room. Good. I'm not much for titles myself, but some people are very particular about these things. And when I am in another man's world, he said, glancing around at the furnishings, I believe in being polite, in humoring them. We were just talking about you, said Emily. Were you? And why was that? He asked. I was just saying to Will that I wished you two could meet, she told him. But we have already met, haven't we? Jeremy replied. Will and I are old chums. What? She said, casting a bewildered look first at Will, then at Jeremy, then back at Will. Jeremy laughed, amused by her confusion. Well, perhaps not chums, he said. Acquaintances, maybe. Let me think. His expression grew thoughtful, and he began pacing the floor, staring at the ground in front of him. We've spoken twice, so we're not strangers. On the other hand, you couldn't yet say we were friends. Nor enemies, certainly. So, where does that leave us? He then stopped and faced Will, as if expecting an answer. But before Will could decide whether or how to respond, Jeremy continued. Yes, acquaintances seems the best option. Acquaintances with a mutual friend, he added, smiling at Emily and bowing his head politely. Friends, she said, emphasizing the plural. He also knows Charlotte. Yes, you've met our little explorer now, haven't you? Said Jeremy. And you and Charlotte are now friends, while we are merely acquaintances? Jeremy stared at Will with a slightly accusatory countenance. Once again, Will wasn't sure whether he was meant to answer. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Will opened his mouth and began to speak, intending to say something apologetic. But he was cut off by a sudden burst of laughter from Jeremy, who then turned and walked back out onto the balcony, where he stood in silence, gazing in the direction of the falls. Emily tugged on Will's sleeve. See what I mean? She whispered. She's quite lovely, said Jeremy, still looking at the waterfall. Who? Charlotte? Will asked, as he and Emily crossed the room and stood at the doorway to the balcony. Charlotte? Yes, she is a lovely girl, he replied. Do you know her name? Do you mean her last name? Will inquired. Last name, said Jeremy, sounding puzzled. Does she have a last name? That would be unusual. I'm afraid I don't know Charlotte's last name, but Emily, Charlotte, Jeremy broke in. He turned and eyed Will skeptically. Her name is Charlotte? That would be quite a coincidence. Will stared back at him, now thoroughly confused. What? He said. Emily unsuccessfully tried to stifle a giggle. I think he's talking about the naiad, she said in a low voice. Who else would I be talking about? Jeremy asked, crossing his arms on his chest. I thought, well, never mind, said Will. No, I don't know her name. You saw her then? Emily asked him. Saw her and heard her song, Jeremy answered. Quite alluring. A song I have never heard and yet remember. And you believe the girl is a water nymph, she said. You may call her what you like, he replied. She is what she is. Then, addressing Will, he added, You really must learn her name. How exactly should I do that? He asked. You must... Jeremy paused and stared vacantly at the floor. After several seconds, he shrugged his shoulders, looked Will in the eye, and said, Ask her. Will almost began to laugh, but he stopped himself, for Jeremy didn't appear to be joking. Okay, he said, I'll do that. Good. Learn her name, said Jeremy absently. Then a smile crept across his lips. Perhaps it is Charlotte. The universe enjoys irony. What about her middle name? Emily chimed in. Yes, Will, said Jeremy. If she doesn't have a last name, then ask her for her middle name. There was a moment of silence. Then Jeremy and Emily both broke into laughter. Will stood there, out of step, as though he had been thrust onto the stage in the middle of an absurdist play, knowing neither the plot nor his lines. So, you weren't amused, said Jeremy. No, replied Will. I mean, yes, that was funny. And yet you didn't laugh. I'm sorry. I just never apologize, said Jeremy, cutting him off sharply. Not in your world, not to anyone, not for anything. Of course, it's your world, he continued after a pause. So do as you please. Apologize as much as you want, I suppose. Jeremy stepped back inside, glanced around the room, then motioned to the sitting area in front of the fireplace. Shall we? He said. Jeremy took a seat on one of the comfortable stuffed chairs, while Will and Emily sat down next to each other on the small love seat facing him. I'm glad you came, said Emily. We both have many questions. And you believe I have answers, Jeremy replied. I hoped you might, she said. Jeremy tilted his head back and stared at the ceiling. We can talk, and I will do my best to address your questions, he said. Let's begin with a joke. From Will. You want me to tell a joke? Will asked. I'm curious to know what amuses you, Jeremy explained. It will allow our minds to get acquainted. Though not in any frame of mind to tell jokes, Will saw no polite way to deny his guest's simple request. He began searching his memory for a good one, for if this would be how their minds met, it should be funny and clever. Unfortunately, however, his mind was now a blank. He couldn't think of any joke. No, said Jeremy, waiting for a response. I'm trying to think, he said. I'm just stuck. The purpose is not to entertain me, Jeremy told him. Rather than the story, try to remember your laughter. Will then chuckled, and a joke came to mind. A strange joke. Hearing it, he had laughed quite hard, but he told it only once, for the response was awkward silence and confused looks. "Okay, I've got it," he said. Then, taking a deep breath and clearing his throat, Will began. And we'll take a break there, and we'll return shortly with part 2 and Will's joke.